Edison and just pure raw perseverance, 1,000 tries to get a light bulb, or the brilliance of Tesla, first time every time, made in the mind, before he designed the hardware. But all of that genius came sort of out of the blue, and that's where I feel that at this time when we're seeing these technologies develop, it's the entire populace. I mean, we're meant, I think, to reach a higher state of potential. Maybe that's what we're all here to do. In my view, I think that is. And if we can stimulate our own individual highest potential in those and others, and maybe we can accomplish some pretty great things. And that's how I think things started in this country. Now we have technologies that can even help us do this, and they're being abused for the same tempting reasons that abuse has always occurred for the last 200 years since the country's founding.
Greed, Nick.
Exactly right, and we even created new creatures, the corporation, the thing that lives on forever, has the same rights as us in the courtroom, yet doesn't have a living soul, but it's motivated by its lifeblood, which is Main Street's sacrificed for Wall Street. And there's a balance in all of this, and I think that's where the average person, again, is saying, wait a minute, this is a country that's composed of individuals, which mean when we talk about the mind and what's possible there, this is what we have to safeguard in this century so that we can continue to have the kind of possibility that we dreamed about over 200 years ago. Things that Jefferson thought about, if he had even vaguely, any of the founding fathers had thought that they could control human thinking processes, that would have been the First Amendment, to exclude that from any tampering.
I wonder what they'd all say right about now if they were living right about now.
It would be interesting. My father passed away when he was 40, when he was in the Congress. That was in the 70s. And I think
that was the plane crash.
Right. And I think back on his time and just how much has changed. I mean, and he was so stunned by all of the breakthroughs in technology. And my grandfather lived into his 90s, so I had a lot of good discussion, understanding how his perception of things had changed. And yet today, the acceleration pace of change is so much more rapid. In the old days, it was, you'd get some theory, and by the time it came out, a product, it'd be 50 years, and then it went, invention started really accelerating, and invention in the 80s was like doubling every 5 years. That's from the invention of the wheel to where they were in technology. Today, it's like every 9 to 10 months and accelerating. How do we even keep up? And that's where this evolution in the way we think and how we utilize the minds that we have, the quantum computers, literally, that we each have, I think that's the challenge for this century. And there are things emerging where we don't want to see them covered under a cloak of secrecy. We want them open, disclosed, and we want serious discussions so that misuse is avoided and the things that can really help us at this time in our history might actually unfold. And I think we're there now. We could do that now.
When we come back, we're going to open up the phone lines, questions for Nick Begich. And then in the final hour, we want your ESP stories. How have you been able to use extrasensory perception? Back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you, Nick Begich. Nick, does HAARP have anything to do with this? I mean, is it being used to manipulate minds?
Well, as a side effect, whether it's deliberate or not, it is certainly possible. Because the operation, in certain modes of operation, they use a pulsed signal that creates an ELF. And ELFs are the extremely low frequency signals which are associated with brain activity. In fact, there is a phenomenon called a frequency following response, where the brain will actually lock on to an external signal. It can be generated by any kind of oscillating electromagnetic field. It can be a pulsed radio wave, or it can be a pulsed microwave, as an example, and that's essentially the stuff of HAARP. What you can do when you're getting, for instance, earth-penetrating tomography, which is one of the applications in HAARP, it is in a 1 to 20 hertz range, or pulses per second, in which the signal is literally hammered into the ionosphere. A very low power signal returns to the Earth, but one of sufficient density to actually change the behavior of people over a fairly large area. And what it does is it causes a mirroring effect. The brain begins to lock onto this signal, begins to mirror it, and it has a general shift in the emotional state of populations. It is exactly what was discussed by Zbigniew Brzezinski in his book when he quoted J.F. Gordon MacDonald when he was at UCLA and was an advisor to President Johnson as a science advisor. And Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote the book Between Two Ages that had this little section in about electronically stroking the ionosphere in just the right way to get this signal to come back to Earth that would manipulate behavior, which is exactly what HAARP can do. And it just so happens that in the Earth-penetrating tomography application, they're within that sort of range of window frequencies where that becomes very possible, either as a side effect or deliberately.
Nick, isn't Brzezinski a very strange person? He seems to be involved in all these very weird situations.
Well, you know, he was one of the founders of the Trilateral Commission, as an example. He was a national security advisor to Jimmy Carter. There's a certain number of people that really influence policy, and I've had the opportunity to meet a lot of them. And what I find,
and Kissinger was one as well.
Sure, absolutely. And you know, when these guys were all coming into prominence was about the time that my dad was in the Congress in the early 70s. And there was a lot shifting and changing. I mean, Richard Nixon's administration, Watergate, and the things that came of that, many of us remember it. But it was just the tip of an iceberg that never got fully shown. And it really was the rot underneath the system that needed to be reformed. I mean, in the FBI, for example, one of the things that was being objected to, again, dealing with personal privacy, and this is right before the Church Committee started investigating abuses of the CIA. And a lot of people don't remember, but that was the outgrowth of Watergate, because it was supposedly ex-CIA guys that broke in.
Well, and Hoover abused the FBI for years.
Oh, yeah. In fact, Boggs wanted Hoover out. He had said so on the floor of the Congress about a year before he and my dad flew out of Anchorage and disappeared. But Boggs was mad because Hoover was tapping his phone and all of his colleagues' phones and communication lines. And, you know, for a lot of those guys, it resulted in essentially blackmail that allowed Hoover to exist for so many decades. And, you know, and the fact is justice didn't get done. Instead of justice getting done, extortion got done, you know, in one sense of the word. And, you know, when you look at government in terms of what actually is influencing the outcomes, you know, right now a lot of people don't realize that there's 2,200 ongoing state and local and national investigations of political people for various forms of corruption. And you know, when you look at control, you know, they wanted to wipe out every prosecutor in the country and replace them with political hacks, and there was reasons for that.
I think Hoover might have been one of the most dangerous men in America.
Yeah, and he was. And what it's again, it's abuse of power, where there's not enough transparency, there's not enough accountability within the bureaucracies that live from administration to administration. Oftentimes the politician is blamed, but he or she is ignorant, and more often than people would really like to believe. And it's because they never ask the probing questions. And bureaucracies, they kind of look at politicians, they go, well, you know, we just got to wait long enough, and they go away. And it happens. And the thing about it is the accountability levels that are needed today when you deal with these technologies, because efficiency is driven by this kind of desire to have everything fit into a nice little pigeonhole, and control of populations, full monitoring of populations may make you feel safe on the one hand, but on the other hand, it makes you totally vulnerable to many kinds of abuse. And some of it can be very simple. You know, we talked about mind control techniques. One of the simplest is the flicker rate, the frequency following response. The flicker rate of light will cause you to, again, lock onto that signal. And think about it in the context of television. When you look at a television, if you look at the screen, the white wall behind you at night, and you see the flicker of the television, if that flicker is maintained within a certain pulse rate, it'll hit a window frequency that can cause all kinds of things to occur. In Japan, a few years back, it caused 700 kids to have epileptic seizures and go off to the hospital, just the flicker rate. You can also create a situation where the brain slows into a low alpha, high theta range, which is a very suggestive, almost a slight light trance-like state, and just deliver you the overt message. You know, here's the message, you know, selling you whatever they're selling you, politicians or soap.